Among the icons of horror, few figures loom larger than the usually hockey mask-wearing, often machete-wielding, sometimes undead figure of Jason Voorhees. When Sean S. Cunningham's original Friday the 13th debuted in 1980, it heralded the boom of the slasher genre, a wave of films inspired by the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Psycho, Black Christmas, and Halloween. And what was once a single, low-budget effort capitalizing on the new wave of horror soon turned into an undying franchise. In the time since, the Friday the 13th films have outlived its original killer, the now headless Pamela Voorhees, the many deaths of Jason, a brief imposter, and the death of the slasher genre in general. There have been 12 Friday the 13th films made over the course of the last 4 decades. But there are way more Fridays that could have been. While most of these unmade movies follow a similar formula, really dumb and horny teens wander into the pointy end of a machete for 90 minutes until a final girl survives. It's fascinating to see what could have been, and sometimes it's a relief to see what didn't happen. So let's take a trip through the many unmade Friday the 13th sequels. The plot of the original Friday the 13th is pretty simple. Bunch of camp counselors reopen an old summer camp after a series of murders years earlier. Murders start happening again. Old lady killer gets her head whacked off. The end. But the film was a huge success. $59 million worldwide on a $550,000 budget. So where do you go from there? Cunningham figured that since Pamela was dead and Jason, at the time, was just a boy who drowned years earlier, a sequel would be an unrelated story, turning the franchise into an anthology like Campfire Stories. It's an idea that would be explored by John Carpenter in 1982 with Halloween 3 to disappointing results. The anthology idea didn't get far, and it's probably best that the producers told Cunningham, "Make it about the little boy, but now he's a big boy who kills." Only 4 months after the release of the first film, Part 2 went into production with Steve Miner as director and Jason as the now bag-headed killer. If, in the course of this video, you ever wonder how so many films could be churned out so fast, remember this quote from Frank Mancuso Jr., producer of several of the movies. "What needs to be said is that the Friday the 13th movies were about as close to a risk-free transaction as possible. I remember several times where the movie would open on Friday, and on Monday, I'd get a call from Paramount saying, 'Go make another one.' It was simply and purely an exercise in commerce." Part 2 was a big hit, and initially, Part 3 would have continued to focus on Part 2 final girl Ginny, now recuperating in a psychiatric hospital. Jason would arrive intent on killing her, with Ginny now the sole focus of revenge instead of your generic lake-loving teens. If Jason slowly killing off people in a hospital in pursuit of the former film's heroine sounds awful familiar to you, that's because it is. Halloween 2 came out in 1981, just a few months after Friday the 13th Part 2. It's pretty obvious that the Friday series, which owes a huge debt to Halloween, was at least briefly considering continued imitation. This possible sequel, described by producers as Friday the 13th meets Cuckoo's Nest, was dropped in favor of the more traditional Crystal Lake Set 3. The formula was locked in now. Oh, and there was a kick-ass disco version of the theme too. Let's jump ahead to 1985. Jason had been killed in Part 4, the final chapter. Was it? But the franchise went on without its lead character in Part 5, A New Beginning. It's pretty clear that Part 6 was meant to have Tommy in the villain role given the cliffhanger ending of 5. But the disappointing box office and fan anger regarding Roy the movie scrapped that initial idea. According to Pam's actress, Melanie Kinnaman, Paramount had mandated that Tommy be set up as the killer, likely wearing the hockey mask, and for final girl Pam to return as the hero, trying to bring him back to his senses. Instead, Part 6 in 1986 brings us a new Tommy and zombie Jason inspired by director Tom McLaughlin's love of gothic horror and universal monsters. While Part 6, Jason Lives, my personal favorite Friday, performed poorly, it was much better received critically. As such, McLaughlin was invited by Paramount to pitch another sequel, and, after discovering that the studio owned the rights to stoner buddy comedy Cheech and Chong, suggested Cheech and Chong meet Jason. Like Abbott and Costello meet the Universal Monsters, but with more weed jokes. Paramount, puff puff, passed. We're now at Part 7, which was eventually released in 1988 as The New Blood. Was it? And the first attempts at a Freddy vs. Jason crossover film have started to happen. However, Paramount, which controlled Friday the 13th, and New Line, which controlled A Nightmare on Elm Street, couldn't come to an agreement over distribution rights. So 7 became what is essentially Carrie vs. Jason, and the crossover attempts would continue for 15 years. Paramount was interested in having New Blood director John Carl Buechler return for the sequel, and he, in turn, wanted to bring back telekinetic heroine Tina. But suddenly, there were 3 different scripts. Buechler developed a treatment where Tina was released from an insane asylum. Tina actress Lar Park Lincoln co-wrote a script where Tina was now a psychologist helping similarly troubled girls. Very Dream Warriors. And Kevin Spiritas, who played Tina's surviving boyfriend Nick, wrote a script where he was the star, New Blood was all just a dream, and Nick was the real killer who eventually murders Tina. Nice try, Kevin. This isn't so much a completely alternative movie as it is a more complete movie. When the script for Part 7 was written, 75% was set in New York. The studio eventually whittled this down to the final act due to a shrinking budget, and mostly had Vancouver double for Manhattan. According to director Rob Hedden, everything about New York was going to be completely exploited and milked. There was going to be a tremendous scene on the Brooklyn Bridge, a boxing match in Madison Square Garden. Jason would go through department stores, he'd go through Times Square, he'd go into a Broadway play. He'd even crawl into the top of the Statue of Liberty and dive off. Yeah, none of that happened. After Jason Takes Manhattan was a disaster, creator Sean S. Cunningham got the rights back and went to New Line to try and get Freddy vs. Jason to happen again. You can see where this is going, it still didn't happen. So they decided to kill off Jason for good. Again. This idea of the end of Jason went through several different iterations, including one where Jason passed the serial killer torch to his never-before-mentioned brother, who went on his own killing spree. The familial themes are still apparent in the finalized Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday. Was it? A movie that is total ass, where a Jason who looks like a literal piece of shit possesses a bunch of different people until he gets dragged to hell by Freddy, in a setup for a movie that wouldn't happen for another decade. So while the producers waited for Freddy vs. Jason to be figured out, they needed to keep Friday the 13th in the public consciousness. What they came up with, Jason X in 2002, aka Jason in Space in the Future, wasn't the first idea. We kicked around different scenarios. Jason in the hood, Jason in the snow, Jason underwater, said producer Noel Cunningham. We had him fighting gangs in LA, in the Arctic, on safari, in space, the NASCAR circuit, everything. We didn't want to shut anything down. I never thought I'd say it, but compared to those ideas, Jason in Space seems downright sensible. In the 15 years between initial discussions and its premiere in 2003, New Line Cinema spent about $7 million and went through dozens of drafts, including at least 10 official scripts, while trying to make Freddy vs. Jason happen. Let's run down some of these many, often totally bonkers, ideas for the face-off between two horror icons. For a deep dive into this troubled production, read Dustin McNeil's book, Slash of the Titans. One of the earliest ideas revealed that Freddy and Jason were assassins for Hell, and after Jason goes to Hell and Freddy's dead, the two are sent back to Earth by the devil. Whoever claims the most souls gets to stay on Earth. Louis Abernathy's script, titled Nightmare 13: Freddy Meets Jason, revealed that Freddy Krueger was a Camp Crystal Lake counselor who abused and drowned a young Jason, putting the killer on a path of revenge. It also had the two battle in a boxing ring made of entrails in hell, accompanied by Adolf Hitler, Ted Bundy, and Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm not making this up. Jason Lives director Tom McLaughlin also proposed a Versus film. His idea? The crossover would take place in an insane asylum, with two patients who just think they're Freddy and Jason instead of the actual killers. Who would want that? A script by Brannon Braga and Ronald D. Moore showed that all the previous Friday stories were just movies, and the real, much more human Jason was now on trial for his dozens of murders, in a script apparently inspired by the O.J. Simpson trial. Jason's nightmares bring Freddy into the real world, and in its climax, the two fight inside a burning mall until they accidentally combine into a two-headed monster and die. Rule 34, I guess. Several proposed scripts involved a cult of Freddy, a group of devotees trying to bring Freddy into the real world through sacrifice. David J. Show's script labeled them the Fredheads, who throw a teenager's heart into Crystal Lake, which, of course, resurrects Jason and leads to the inevitable battle. Peter Briggs' version reveals the Voorhees family as part of the mob that killed Freddy, and the now dream killer Freddy the one who caused Jason's death and resurrection. The devil is involved, but Jason winds up killing him. But it doesn't stop there. An FBI agent named Jack Cobain, the 90s, time travels to prevent Freddy from being released from prison, effectively erasing both Freddy and Jason from history. Mark Verheiden's script from the late 90s did a clue. One ending has Freddy win, one has Jason win, with these shown at random in theaters. Some scripts had a Tommy Jarvis cameo. Some had Alice from Dream Master and Dream Child. Damian Shannon and Mark Swift's draft eventually became the version that reached the screen, but their proposed ending featuring a cameo by Pinhead of Hellraiser didn't make it. The crossover was a huge hit, so of course the studios wanted a sequel. And the idea everyone seemed to want was Freddy vs. Jason vs. Ash, the hero of the Evil Dead franchise, still played by Bruce Campbell. The premise had Freddy use the Book of the Dead to grow his power while Ash, now in Crystal Lake running the local S-Mart, fought the Dream Demon and Jason. Creative differences prevented the crossover expansion from happening, but the general premise was turned into a comic, which itself got a sequel, an even bigger crossover that brought back all the survivors of each franchise to do battle. Eventually, both Friday and Nightmare were rebooted, with the success of Jason's new movie leading to sequel discussions. The 2008 recession stalled those sequel efforts, which led to continued changes in production rights. But a finished sequel draft by writers Damian Shannon and Mark Swift bears the unfortunate title Friday the 13th: Camp Blood: The Death of Jason Voorhees. It also would have taken place in the snow. Well, Jason never got the chance to die proper since the franchise has been dead since the reboot. But it's not for lack of trying. After the death of the proper reboot sequel, Nick Antosca wrote yet another reboot for Paramount, this time set in the 80s and taking place shortly after the original film. Jason was supernatural from the start, and generally the movie was made to play like a straightforward, nostalgic entry in the series. But after Antosca penned a draft, multiple changes delayed the prospective film. It's been referred to as Friday the 13th Part 13, as well as Friday the 13th 3D, and was scrapped in 2015. At some point during this period, Paramount and Platinum Dunes also briefly considered a TV series. No, not the 80s one that has nothing to do with Jason. With Antosca's script dead, writer Aaron Guzikowski's version was considered, this time rebooting the origin again and featuring Pamela Voorhees. Young Jason drowns, Pamela goes on a killing spree and is killed, and then suddenly alive and older Jason returns for vengeance. The long unseen Elias Voorhees, father of Jason, is also involved, briefly the villain and then killed. 3 killers, nods to 4 different previous films, and a heaping helping of Rob Zombie's Halloween remake. Paramount cancelled plans after the failure of horror relaunch, and altogether a film that doesn't exist, Rings, failed at the box office. In recent years, an ongoing legal battle over franchise rights between Cunningham and original film writer Victor Miller has put the franchise, and even much of its merchandise, on hold. But LeBron James' production company Spring Hill Entertainment has been in talks to bring a new film to life. One version, Friday the 13th: The Beginning, has been written by Clint Ford. Hey look, another origin story. People just love the hottest film trend of 2008. Another, Jason Never Dies, has been written by Tom McLaughlin, director of Jason Lives and he of the Cheech and Chong and Insane Asylum pitches. It's a direct sequel to Part 6 and ignores all the other films that came after. The hottest film trend of 2017! It's also set in the winter. The people want Frosty Jason. And that brings us up to 2019. And I'm sure this video will be quickly rendered obsolete by another 5 Friday the 13th pitches that will have been submitted in the next year. At the moment, the Friday the 13th franchise lies dormant at the bottom of Crystal Lake due to the ongoing legal battle between Cunningham and Miller. Although fan films like Never Hike Alone keep the spirit of the franchise alive. But if time has taught us anything, it's that Jason will always come back to life when you least expect.